Alex Salmond and his SNP think they know what an independent Scotland would look like. Some of it seems very familiar. He says Scotland would remain part of the European Union, keep sterling as its currency within a monetary union with the rest of the UK. But as befits a social democrat, he's also promised more public spending on increased childcare provision, safeguards on pension benefits and free personal care for the elderly. The SNP claims independence would leave people better off by £1,000, though that partly depends on the price of oil. Better Together, the cross-party campaign arguing against independence, has naturally been attacking the SNP on all fronts. George Osborne, backed by Labour and the Lib Dems, says there will be no monetary union. If Scotland walks away from the UK, it walks away from the pound. EU Commission President Barroso told the BBC it would be extremely difficult for Scotland to join the EU after a yes vote. His successor, Jean-Claude Juncker, this week said he agreed. Unions have a contentious offer of their own. They claim Scots benefit by £1,400 by being part of the UK. Earlier this year, the Yes campaign was gaining ground, but the latest poll from this morning still shows a significant lead of 14% for the No campaign, leaving the SNP to claim it'll all go their way in the last 10 weeks. And Nicola Sturgeon, the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, joins me now from Glasgow. Good morning, Nicola Sturgeon.
Andrew.
You want an independent Scotland to keep the pound, stay in a UK monetary union, stay in NATO, stay in the EU. Now, Scotland already has all that, but you can't guarantee that it would have any of it in an independent Scotland. Why take the risk?
Well, we say that all of these things should be the case because they are in the best interests of Scotland and indeed in the best interests of the rest of the UK. But we want the powers of independence, the fiscal and the economic powers, to enable us to grow our economy faster, to be more productive, to grow our working age population and over time increase the prosperity of people living in Scotland. We also want powers over our social security system so that we can create a system that meets our needs, one that encourages and supports people into work but also has a safety net for the most vulnerable in our society. So independence is about putting the powers over our own future into Scottish hands so that we can decide our own priorities and use our own resources.
I understand all that, but you didn't answer my question. You cannot guarantee that you would be able to keep the pound within a monetary union, stay in NATO and stay in the EU. I know you want to do it, but you can't guarantee you can produce any of these things, correct?
I would argue that we can, because these things are not just in Scotland's interest but in the interests of the rest of the UK. If you take currency, for example, I mean, the first point is that no country can be prevented from using the pound. What we propose, of course, is to use the pound within a formal monetary union. And since you and I last spoke about this issue, of course, we've had the UK minister quoted in The Guardian saying that the position of the UK government right now is one based on campaign rhetoric, and following a yes vote, of course, there would be a currency union.
Who was that minister?
The minister is unnamed. You perhaps have a better idea of that than I do, but nevertheless that story in The Guardian I think was a solid one and wasn't substantially denied.
So you're basing your monetary policy on one unnamed minister in one story?
I'm basing it on common sense, Andrew, because the currency union proposition of the Scottish Government is absolutely in the best interests of Scotland, given our trading relationship with the rest of the UK, but it's also overwhelmingly in the interests of the rest of the UK, given their trading relationship with Scotland and, of course, the contribution that Scotland's exports make to the UK's balance of payments. I think the central point here is that we're having a passionate debate in Scotland. It's actually a very good debate, and the UK government and the No campaign, and this is not a criticism of them, it's simply a statement of fact, want to talk up uncertainty and risk and make people feel scared of a no vote. But after a yes vote, if that is what happens, then the Scottish Government and the UK Government will enter into a constructive process of negotiation that's in the interests of all of us.
Right, well, let's just stick with the monetary union for a minute, because most economists agree that it would be very good for an independent Scotland to have a monetary union. But George Osborne, Ed Balls, Danny Alexander, they're all unequivocal. They say you won't get it. Now, you claim they're bluffing, but again, you can't guarantee that. So why take the risk?
Well, what I would say is the benefits of independence are substantial, but I would also say to George Osborne and to his counterparts in the other parties that it's going to be a very brave Chancellor or aspiring Chancellor that says to businesses in the rest of the UK that they have to incur additional unnecessary transaction costs of perhaps £500 million a year. That's a Conservative estimate, or that the UK balance of payments should lose the contribution of Scotland's substantial exports. What we are doing is making a case that is based on common sense, and voters in Scotland will listen to that case. They'll listen to the case being put forward by the other side, and they'll come to a judgment of what they consider is the common sense position. And I would argue that the position the Scottish Government is putting forward is that common sense position.
Let's look at EU membership, see, because you haven't been able to guarantee the money union. Let's see about membership. When the EU Commission President Barroso, followed by the Council of Ministers President Van Rompuy, said that a seamless transition to EU membership for an independent Scotland was anything but certain, indeed one said it could even be impossible, you dismissed them because they were both standing down. The new Commission President Juncker says exactly the same thing. Do you just dismiss him too?
Juncker said last week, and it's a comment I very much welcome, that he would respect the democratic process and the outcome of that democratic process in Scotland. But again, what we are doing, and I should say at the outset of this, we have said repeatedly to the UK Government, let's go jointly to the European Commission and ask for a formal opinion of the European Commission. The European Commission have said they will only give that opinion at this stage if the UK Government, as the current member state, asks for it. The UK Government are refusing point blank to do that, and you have to wonder why, because they might not like the answer, and also because it's in their interest to talk up uncertainty. Again, we've put forward a common sense proposition. Scotland is an integral part of the European Union. We've been an integral part for 40 years. We comply with all of the rules and regulations of the European Union.
Mr. Juncker knows all that. Mr. Juncker knows all that, but he still says that it will be anything but a seamless transition.
What he said is you couldn't join the European Union by sending a letter. That's not our proposal. We set down a robust and a common sense transition process, both in terms of the provision of the European Treaty that would be used, Article 48, and the timescale that we consider to be reasonable in these circumstances. And you know, there are 160,000 nationals of other European states living in Scotland right now, many of them in this Commonwealth city of Glasgow. If we were to be outside of the European Union for any period of time, something that the current treaties doesn't even provide for, then they would lose the right to stay here. The interests of Scotland and the interests of the European Union are in favour of a seamless transition in that 18-month period. Again, it comes down to common sense, and people in Scotland will make their own judgment on who's talking the common sense position on these issues.
What about NATO membership? Only 2 years ago you told Newsnight the SNP's position is no, we wouldn't stay in NATO. What changed?
We had a democratic debate at our party conference. I know that's unusual in UK politics right now, but we had a debate. We looked at whether it would be in the interest of an independent Scotland, which of course forms a significant part of the territory of the North Atlantic, to remain within NATO. Yes, the party changed its mind, and it did so in a thoroughly democratic way. You know, that's the nature of democracy. Would that there was more democratic discussion in some other parties in the Westminster system.
Would you accept the protection of the NATO nuclear umbrella?
Well, we accept what we'd be signing up to in terms of NATO, but there is no doubt that the SNP's position, and I think the position of the majority of people in Scotland, is that we don't want nuclear weapons in Scotland, and we want to see the world, including NATO countries, rid themselves of nuclear weapons. I mean, one of the interesting points here is that of the 28 member countries of NATO, 25 don't have nuclear weapons. So an independent Scotland...
I asked you if you would accept the nuclear umbrella. The key feature of NATO's military doctrine is nuclear first strike. Do you accept that doctrine?
No, and no member of NATO is required to take part in action that it doesn't agree with. But we would accept the basis on which NATO is founded. But we would argue two things. Firstly, we want Trident removed from Scotland, rather than have a situation where we're spending £100 billion over the next generation replacing Trident, and we would argue within the international community and specifically within NATO that the world should move much more quickly to rid itself of nuclear weapons. That's a principled position, and it's one that the SNP has held consistently, as you know, for many years.
But you would get rid of one of the key parts of the NATO deterrent, which is based in Scotland. You would kick that out. And you would also say that you wouldn't actually accept all the club rules because you don't like the idea of nuclear at all. Why would they let a member like you in?
Well, because NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation and Scotland is a significant part of the territory of the North Atlantic.
But you don't subscribe to the rules.
Well, 25 of the member states of NATO are non-nuclear members. Scotland would
support the NATO military doctrine, Nicola Sturgeon. You're saying you don't.
But NATO itself says that it wants to move away from reliance on nuclear weapons. And independent Scotland would be entering the majority mainstream of NATO as a country that didn't have nuclear weapons. And having led by example in removing nuclear weapons, I think our moral authority in trying to encourage others across the world to do likewise would be considerably increased.
Let me come on to money and oil. The finance minister in your government, Swinney, has said that an independent Scotland would increase public spending by 3% a year. He'd pay for that extra by borrowing. Your First Minister says that he's going to stash money in an oil fund. So in other words, you're saying you're going to borrow and you're going to save. How does that work?
There's 2 points here, and let me take them one by one. Firstly, in terms of the outlook for finances and what is one of the central debates in this referendum campaign, which is austerity that we know will continue if we stay as part of the Westminster system versus prosperity. And what we've said very clearly and very openly and honestly is that the economy can afford a higher level of increase in public spending while we continue to have deficit levels at a sustainable level. And that, I think,
what's the point of borrowing and saving at the same time?
Well, people who have a mortgage and who also have a savings account would know themselves what the wisdom of that is. What we have said, and this is based on recommendations of our expert fiscal commission, that as borrowing in Scotland reduces to sustainable levels, it makes sense to start saving a proportion of our oil wealth in an oil fund. And, you know, we look at Norway, a country with many similarities to Scotland, that right now has an oil fund worth £500 billion. Scotland, as part of the Westminster system, is sitting on a share of the £1.5 trillion of UK debt. So we've got a choice. We can continue to allow our oil wealth, our vast oil wealth, to be mismanaged by Westminster governments, or we can decide that we're going to steward and manage that resource better in the years to come.
Of course, your figures don't add up unless you're right about oil prices and oil revenues, and you've been consistently wrong in your predictions of that. Last year, the Scottish Government forecast that revenues would be 3.7 billion more than they actually were from oil. 3.7 billion, which is about the cost of the Scottish school system, gone because you couldn't get your calculations right.
There were particular reasons for that in terms of some interruptions in production and also the record levels of investment in the North Sea.
You would still have to find the money.
But let me just explain what our oil projections are based on, and they're based on robust assumptions. Firstly, a production estimate that is in line with the estimates of the oil and gas industry. I mean, we saw OBR figures that are based on production of 10 billion barrels of oil over the next 28 years.
Oil and gas has been wrong for the past 3 years as well.
It's 24 billion left to be recovered. That figure of 24 billion is actually what's in the UK government's oil and gas strategy. So production in line with industry estimates and an oil price of $110 a barrel, which is flat in cash terms, so would be a real terms reduction. The Department of Energy and Climate Change in the UK government is estimating $128 a barrel. So our estimate is actually, compared to that, a cautious one. So these are robust estimates based on robust assumptions.
Except they've recently been wrong. But let me move into the final point. We hear a lot from you and your fellow nationalists. You want a Scandinavian-style social democracy, and you've certainly got the spending plans. You know how to spend the money like a social democrat, but you never tell us about social democratic levels of taxation. All social democracies have higher level of tax than Scotland does at the moment. So what taxes would go up?
We're not proposing tax. I want a Scottish style of social democracy. I'm part of a government that has introduced policies like free education, free medicines and balanced the books every single year we've been in government. We want to get more people into work in Scotland, raise the level of participation in the labour market, make our economy more productive so that we're raising the overall tax revenue of government. Over the last 33 years, in each and every one of the last 33 years, we've generated more tax per head of population than is the case in the rest of the UK.
That was
and
when
it's
the
also
oil
the
was
case.
flowing.
In those last 33 years, in some of those years, oil prices will have been high, and others, oil prices will have been low. But we'll also take different decisions, Andrew. A report published last week showed that if we go, as part of the Westminster system, down the route of replacing Trident, then the cost of that over the next generation will be as high in some years in the 2020s as £4 billion every year. Our share of that is £300 million a year. Let's get our access to our own resources so that we can make different and better decisions about how we spend the resources we already have.
So let me just get this clear. You're promising Scandinavian-style social democratic levels of public spending, but you say you won't need a top rate of tax of 56%, which is what Scandinavia has. You won't need a VAT of 25%, which is what Scandinavia has, and you won't need VAT on food of between 12 and 15%. So you're going to have all the spending, but none of the taxes that make that possible in Scandinavia.
I'm sure for purely mischievous reasons you're misrepresenting what I'm saying. We want levels of public spending in Scotland that the Scottish economy can afford and that also help us to generate more wealth in our economy. We want to use the existing resources that Scotland has. We're the 14th richest country in the world in terms of what our economy produces per head of population, but we don't want to be wasting resources on Trident nuclear weapon replacement. We want to be spending the resources we have on the things that are actually the priorities of people in Scotland. And these are the benefits and the opportunities that we only get if we take the opportunity of voting yes and becoming independent.
Nicola Sturgeon, thanks for joining us from Glasgow.